So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and today we're going to talk about challenge ratings of monsters and really how to use the system, because as it's written, it's a tricky thing, and it's useful in some ways, but it's finicky at best. So I'm glad that Wizards of the Coast has it. I'm glad that they have what they have, but let's decode it. Let's unlock some ways to use it in a way that is gonna help you and demystify the whole thing. So Jeff, talk to me a little bit about CR.
Yeah, so for people who are maybe not quite as familiar with it, let me sort of set up what the Wizards baseline for CR is kind of supposed to be. Um, and then we can sort of talk about some of the reasons why, in my experience, it hasn't been quite as useful as they might claim that it would be. So the idea behind CR is that a monster's CR is roughly what would be an equivalent challenge to a 4-character party of the same level. So a CR3 monster would be a good challenge for a party of level 3 characters. At least that's kind of the way that they set it up. And there's, I think, optional ways in like the DMG of like balancing different numbers of CRs and, encounter deadliness levels and things like that. Now, part of the issue with CR in terms of the 5e mechanics is that there's so many factors to a monster that like balancing it to one single number can become, I think, a little tricky. So one very obvious, very clean example is a monster like the Banshee, sort of like the common example that people will use when talking about CR, but there's a good reason for that. So the Banshee is written in the monster manual is CR4, which should mean, theoretically, that it's a good challenge for a party of level 4 characters. Now, there's an interesting part about the Banshee, though, that can make this basically become irrelevant, which is their whale ability, once per day. Basically, creatures within range need to make a Constitution saving throw. On a failure, they go to 0 hit points, so they're just out of the fight. So you could have a situation, it's unlikely, but it's theoretically possible, where you could be a level 20 party, if you just happen to be grouped up and a Banshee is there and whales, and just the party all rolls badly, you could have basically a CR4 monster wipe the entire party in one move, even though they're 16 levels higher than what the CR, was supposed to be, with just some unlucky rolls. And that basically, invalidates the CR rating of the Banshee in certain chances. Now, the odds of that are low, of course, especially at that level. You're going to have good modifiers and abilities that might let you overwrite that so it doesn't affect you, and things like that. But that sort of idea like fragments down a lot into less obvious cases of monsters that can like turn characters to stone or have spells like hold person that can paralyze a party member, and then suddenly they're getting crit every single turn. And then even though it's 5 goblins, if one of the goblins can, it's 5 goblins and a creature that can paralyze, it doesn't matter what level you are. If you get crit every single attack and you can't take actions, like you will lose that fight. And that issue can kind of spread out. So, a creature might have super low CR, but have a really high armor class, which might make it deceptively difficult because it's so hard to hit it. If it has a 20 AC, even though it's a challenge rating 1, at that point your modifiers are so low. Or a creature might, do a lot of damage for its challenge rating, but have low health for its challenge rating. So you might think like, oh, I'll put a bunch of them, and then suddenly you kill a player in like 2 hits because they all deal. So there's a lot of factors: how much damage the creature does, how much HP it has, how much armor class it has, do its abilities paralyze or petrify or poison or go invisible. There's all these different factors, and the party might just by chance not have a great way to deal with whatever thing that they come across. So if no one has a way to see an invisible creature is going to be difficult to fight, like no matter what CR you're working with. So there's a ton of factors into CR. And another thing, just to be, at least again, this is all in my experience and the experience of almost everyone I talk to. CR is almost always a little underbaked comparatively. Like, I don't know if you guys can speak to different experiences, but every single time I've put like a CR monster against a 4-person party, they always destroy it. Like always crush it. Like if it's like a 1v4 where it's just a challenge 4 monster versus a level 4 party, I've never seen that be close before, unless there's crazy bad or crazy good rolls, on one side or the other. So it can become difficult to balance everything basically because there's so many factors, and just having one single number as an expression of like all those different abilities and stats and everything, it's just, there's no way that it's going to be consistently accurate, especially when you start to factor into action economy versus how many of these creatures are there, how many players are there. There's just so much to it that it's difficult to boil down to just a number. So I think a lot of people have sort of had that experience of like, oh, wow, I thought this was going to be really difficult, or I thought this was going to be really easy, and it was completely the other way around. Where did I go wrong? I balanced it out just like it said in the book. Well, like, that's kind of where things went wrong, is that it's not always a good indicator. So next question becomes then the obvious thing of like, well, then what do I do? If challenge rating is not super reliable, what do I do? And the other two guys both have sort of their own ways.
So then, like Jeff just said, well, how do we do it then? What do we do? Are we just up the creek? And so I'm going to give you some ideas that I use. The only way to use a system like this is trial and error. I've made a lot of errors. So it's never an exact science, but with a group of, say, 4 players. So this is kind of what my average group is, 4 or 5 players. What I do is I call them powerful enemies and lesser enemies. It's all about number of creatures. So this gives the people in the combat options to run around, kind of do different stuff. It's a little more to track, but I think that the squeeze is worth the juice. So these powerful enemies, I do about half as many as the party. So if I have 4 or 5, I'm going to do like 3 powerful enemies. What do I consider powerful? Well, and now we're looking at CRs. I try to take about 1 CR lower than the party. So if, Jeff, in your example, it's CR4 or whatever, I'll take how many people are in the party, and then I'll do 1 CR lower, and I'll do about half as many as there are players. So for that example, let's say there's 5 players. I would do 3 CR3 monsters. That's how I start. Then what I do is I take about an equal number of lesser enemies. And by a lesser enemy, I usually go like half the CR. So if it's a CR4, I do like CR2s. So I'll do, and it depends how powerful the party is or how good they are. So you can basically take, now I've got my 3 powerful enemies that are 1 CR lower than the party. I'll either do 3 lesser enemies, or I might do 1 for each person in the party. If I'm running a game for some of the people that I play with, they are very well versed. They know how to use their powers. They know how to work together. So I might do 1 CR1 or 2 monster for every one of them. That's how I start. So again, you're like, okay, I have 4 players. Perfect. What level are they? Well, they're level 5. Okay, so that's CR5. So you have 4 players, CR5. 2 monsters that are CR4. Boop, boop. And then 4 monsters that are like CR2. That's where I start. From there, it usually goes pretty well. 2 other things that you should do when you're choosing these monsters. Take a quick glance, like Jeff mentioned about the Banshee. Take a quick glance at what their special moves are. If they have, and you don't need to know, really, but just meaning you don't have to have experience with all of these, because every monster is going to have usually 1 unique ability and then maybe 1 that's shared. Just have an idea. If you put in 5 things that have multi-attack, that is now a bunch more attacks. So just bear that in mind. The other thing I don't roll for monster damage. I do, in the monster's attack, there's a little parenthetical number that is the average if you were to roll plus what you add to it. So if it's 6, they just do 6. That's it. So I'm dealing a very consistent, stable amount of damage. That keeps that number a little more manageable without any swingy stuff. So barring any crits, I just, boom, this monster does 6 when it hits you. 6 points of damage, 6 points. And then for the other ones, it might be 2 or 3 or whatever. I just dole that out. And then it keeps things pretty even. That tends to work for me. So that's like my fake sort of armchair way that I've learned to game CR. The last 2 or 3 times I've done it that way, it has always shaken out to where I've dropped a couple people, meaning I've gotten some of the players down to 0 hit points or they were making death saves. And it also shook out to where it felt like they were able to hit stuff and really feel powerful. One final tip is that I almost always will give the monsters about half the hit points that they have because I like fights to go faster. I've never had a complaint that a combat went, oh wow, that was too fast. But I've always had complaints about, wow, can we wrap it up? So now that changes everything. You can do that. Mileage may vary, but again, it's better to have a combat go quicker and then next time just put a monster in there, one more monster, rather than, well, I don't know, I guess you can cut that part out. So I'll say this. Mileage may vary on that part. That's just an extra thing that I do on a taste and preference. But I find that my combats are quick. They're pretty dangerous, but they feel light and lean.
So I, based on a lot of things Jeff said about CR, I just don't use D&D 5th edition. That's my secret. No.
DMs hate him.
Jeff pointed out a lot of the reasons that CR is finicky and silly, and he focused a lot on creatures from the game. It's funny because a lot of the things he said also applies to the players. So I just wanted to throw that out there that I'm like, you can see how it's very, very difficult to really get a handle on, and that's by design, in a sense. So I'm happy that Tim's answer was sort of so technical in the sense of challenge rating, because my way is I pick the monsters I want to tell the story, right? So like one time my players went to a swamp and I wanted a swamp with hags in it. So I picked the hags and I made sure, I looked at CRs and I was like, okay, well, CRs of this thing might have a little less HP, whatever. And I had a rough idea, but that was earlier in the process. But the idea was they showed up, there are hags there. They say what they need to say, do what they need to do for the narrative. The players fight them a little bit. They use some abilities. One player took a lantern and lit one on fire by throwing at it. That was a cool thing. The scene happened, right? I used the hags as more as set dressing, and I kept track of their HP and stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I have effectively moved away from it enough that I keep track of how much damage the players have done. But when the combat starts getting to the point where we've seen all there is to see, it's run its course, we're just beating this last hag with our sword and we can't seem to get a hit, the combat has ended by then, because that's where the scene in the movie would have ended. So I don't worry about CR really at all. I take the monsters I want in my game. I have a rough idea of, some of the abilities of the players and stuff, but generally just make sure I don't kill the players in one hit and they don't kill the monsters in one hit. And that's balanced enough usually for what I want to do.
Yeah, and my approach kind of sits somewhere, I think, between Tim and James there, in the sense of, like, I don't really use the CR as written basically at all. In fact, this is just a personal thing. I usually just make all my own monster stat blocks. I don't usually take them from the book. It's fun for me to do it that way. I'm not recommending that as a course of action or saying that using monsters is bad or anything like that. I totally get using monsters. It's faster and easier and probably with better results. It's just a personal taste of mine that I like making my own enemies. But the way that I usually try to basically approach it is there's a couple things that I like to basically keep in mind, a couple factors to balance going into the fight, just to make sure that it's not a tragic stomping one way or the other. And the couple things that I like to look at is I will sort of get a gauge of where the party is at. I'll obviously know what level they're at, what classes they're playing, which that'll give me a good sense of kind of where their hit points are going to be. Almost everybody I play does average hit points, nobody rolls, so I don't have to worry about like crazy outliers or anything like that. So the couple things that I'll look at. On average, what kind of damage the party will do. So like if you're level 5 and you're a fighter, you're probably going to be doing 2 attacks, assuming they both hit a d8 plus 3 to 5 damage or so. So we'll call it like an even like 10 hit points per attack, 2 attacks. So 20 damage around on average. That number is going to vary wildly across actual play, but it's a safe math bet. So if I have a party that's going to do that, then a monster with 20 hit points is going to last a turn, basically. Assuming that the attacks hit and the average damage shakes out approximately, a monster is going to last a turn, maybe 2 turns. And similarly, the party will have, whatever level they're at, they'll have kind of an average hit point range. So I can look at the monsters and say, I kind of want the party to be dropped after like 3 to 4 hits, maybe. Because similar to Tim, I like monsters and players to die fast in my combats. I think it's just more exciting that way. So I'll have low ACs, but high damage. Hit points sort of depending on how long I want that monster to be around for. And basically just plan out, without getting too crazy, I don't have like a bunch of math spreadsheets and all these calculations that I'll do or anything, but just sort of rough estimates of like, the party can probably kill this monster in 1 or 2 turns. So given that I have 4 players, that's 2 players' turns basically will kill this monster. And if the monster hits them, it'll do like roughly 25% of their hit points, give or take. And I'll basically just plan out my encounters that way of like, assuming things shake out approximately as they should, the monsters will do about this much damage per hit and the players will do about this much damage per hit. And I'll push the numbers as high or low as I want the battle to be difficult, basically. And then the other thing I'll do is basically balance opportunities for cataclysm on one side or the other. So an obvious way is like, if you have one monster against a party, you always have to have in the back of your mind that someone's going to have that hold person spell or that hold monster spell, and your monster's paralyzed, the fight's done. So basically, doesn't matter what CR the monster is. If it fails that wisdom save, the fight's done. It can't take actions. The party all crits it, and it's just the fight's over. So if you're going to run a 1v4, you have to plan for that contingency. The party might just get a good spell off on it, and it might be dead. And maybe you're okay with that, in which case you can just run it. If you're not okay with that, you can give it like legendary resistances or bonus to spell saves or add more other monsters that'll be around this monster that can then help try to disrupt concentration and things like that. I'll sort of leave the fine details to be discovered as they will. And then the things obviously go the other way of like, if you have monsters that might paralyze a party when they hit, and you have 4 of those monsters and you have 4 party members, there's a world in which each one of them hits a player and they all get stunned and then they all die. So just keeping an eye out for those game changer abilities, the things that deal status effects like paralyzation and stun. Keeping an eye out for like action economy, like a 1 monster versus lots of players is almost always going to be very imbalanced just because the party gets so many more chances to do things. And yeah, basically besides that, I don't really look at the CR numbers themselves. I basically just, if I use a stat block or if I make one, basically just try to move the numbers around so that I know about how many hits people will go down in, keep an eye out for the abilities that'll totally change the game and like wipe a fight, and plan around those and then just kind of let the fight go from there.
And that's how you can use the CR system. That is some of the pros of it, many of the cons, and then how you can actually make sense of it. But, really it's just a matter of just figuring out what works for your table through trial and error. So hopefully those ideas help you do that. We're Tabletop Terrors. We love creativity. We love tabletop games. And of course, we love fun. So if you love those things too, welcome to the channel. Consider subscribing. And if you hit the notification bell, it will tell you when videos just like this are up on the channel. We also have a Patreon where if you're interested at all in learning game design or seeing some of the cool little chunks that we design, little RPG things, you can also check that out, as well as some other tiers. But in the comments, tell us how you use CR. What is it that you use? How do you use it? Do you have a trick? Do you use it as written? And how does it work for you? Anything like that. Or, of course, as usual, anything else. Let's end things with a TabTerian Toast.
May you mend the first brick.
May you kill the first CR1 snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
CR. So I remember, this is going way back, like 2005, I don't know. I was listening to podcasts on my iPod, which had a monochrome screen, so we'll just do that math. And I remember hearing about the new version of Dungeons and Dragons, and I heard Mike Merles, I believe, and he was talking about 4E. And what made it so exciting is because I was trying to learn 3.5 at the time, Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition 0.5, and I couldn't get my head around CR, because if you think it's complicated in 5e, 3.5 was, even more complicated. So one of the most exciting things is that the way they were pitching 4e was that the CR was like seamless and simple, and you build the challenge by slotting in certain things that cost a certain number of points. So if you were going to build a CR4 encounter, you put in a blaster and a controller and a this and a that, and it was super clean and fun. I didn't play enough 4E to actually use it, so I don't know if it worked or not. But I remember being really excited about that, and I feel like there's still a world where, with all the math we have for 5E, you could do it.